be quiet.
When you're being
what they did, they should tear up the Treaty of Rome, the Treaty of Maastricht, the Lisbon Treaty. They should put all the euros into a coffin, send them back to Brussels, say thank you very much, goodbye, reissue the punt, devalue it by 30%, and then say we'll settle our debts on our terms and everybody else's. End of that sentence.
Well, it's quite simple, isn't it, Thomas? I mean, you have the answer to it, and that came really from you and Sir Hugh O'Donoghue, barrister at Carmelite Chambers, that this is the solution for the Republic of Ireland.
Correct.
But they've got to act on it. Is that right, Thomas?
Well, yes, but you see, unfortunately, the politicians today have no love for the people of the country they represent, or desire to actually improve their lives. They live in terror of this evil force which has assembled itself in Brussels. And so they will do whatever they're told to do. They're like puppets on the end of a string. And there are no fiscal controls in place anywhere in the Western world. They've all been dismantled, which is why you have this chaos. And the euro, as it's called, which is a political gimmick, was actually called the ECU, which was founded back in the early 60s, and it was a means of major corporations within the mainland Europe and here, Great Britain, being able to trade among themselves without going through the foreign exchange area of life and having to deal with the variations of the value of currency. So they had the ECU. And when Mr. Mitterrand and Mr. Kohl with Mr. Delors discovered they weren't going to get a yes vote in France on Maastricht, which meant they wouldn't get political union, they changed the name of the ECU to the euro, and they then imposed very stringent regulations on the euro on the basis that when it had been up and running for a few years, they would then impose political union. And unfortunately, the financial crisis came along and upset the apple cart. And so you now have nothing but total and utter chaos. The Lisbon Treaty, which is meant to be the new constitution for Europe, which replaces all the constitutions of all the member states, because you can't have more than one constitution representing a country, was meant to allow the member states with the euro to close down their central banks so that the European Bank would take central control. Not one country has closed down its central bank. We're now going to have European Union embassies all over the world, but each country that belongs to the European Union happens to have its own embassy in each member state. And the reason they're still there is the ambassador's role is to protect the investments of the country he represents in that particular country. So the whole thing is a nonsense. You would close down all the airlines and have one airline called the European Union Airline, but they won't do it.
It's quite serious. In fact, it's more than quite serious. It's incredibly serious, Thomas.
And so the solution is war.
And especially for Ireland, it's more serious than anywhere else at the moment. And what they could do is become historically famous, because they could cut away, be the first country that could cut away from the ECU, correct?
The ECU, the euro.
ECU,
yes.
or ECU. ECU. Yeah. And then they would go down in history, correct?
They most certainly would. But you see, it's the same old story. When you have a boil, the thing is to lance it. The people who appear on the scene from the IMF and the European Central Bank, who look rather like dirty old men wearing their raincoats like flashers, and they wear shoes which are not properly made with leather soles, which need polish, and their trousers need pressing. They have no money. The IMF is currently void of any money. It's gone to the United States government and the British government to ask to be refunded. So the idea they're going to lend money to the Irish economy is just a bad joke. They might write a piece of paper saying, here you are, you've won another 99 billion euros, whatever it is. But it's meaningless. There is no money. So they've forgotten that the wealth of a nation comes from what every person living in that nation does in a positive way during their daytime. It doesn't matter how small a positive thing they do, whether it's like clean their homes or whatever they're doing, it's that positive element which makes the wealth of a nation. Today, it's all down to people who think it's very clever to lend money at very high rates of interest, and they have this idea that they can get rid of the military by holding everyone in a vice of debt, and by that you control them. So if they don't behave, they're bankrupted and they take away their material wealth. And as a result, you have people who are no longer prepared to work, they're no longer creative, and the Asian markets are now taking over India and China, where they work. So we are in a situation now where none of our political leaders have any understanding of their constitutions. You only have to look at our own here with this unelected coalition government. Two men, we're told one went to Slough Grammar, which they call Eton, the other one went to Westminster. They're both communists. They're both, they're not Christians. They pretend to be, like their former Prime Minister, Mr. Blair. And they talk about an elected second chamber, and they talk about having fixed term parliaments, 5-year plans. I've seen all that during my lifetime in something that was called the Soviet Union, and every single 5-year plan failed.
It's against the prerogative of the Queen. It takes away the prerogative of the monarch, the 5-year plan, because the monarch has the prerogative of calling Parliament, correct?
Correct.
So we want, in this country, it's a constitutional monarchy, and we want the monarch to still has her prerogatives, or his prerogatives, whichever we have a lady or a man on the throne. Correct, Thomas?
Well, it's correct, but you see, the one thing about the Mother of Parliaments, as the British Parliament is called, it was Pluto who invented this thing called democracy, which doesn't actually work. He said, of course, the trouble with democracy is they will always end in tyranny, and that the finest form of government you could ever have would be to have a constitutional monarchy. Now, it took this country many hundreds of years to actually achieve that, and we achieved it, 350 years ago, after that Republican Oliver Cromwell had beheaded Charles I, and his heir came to the throne. And we have a very brilliant system where you have the monarch with little political power, but it's not that matters, it's the power the monarch prevents others having, which is the ultimate power. And so you have people who would normally spend their lives sitting around their tables in places like Islington discussing their neurosis over a cup of tea or coffee in the morning with their girlfriends, who then go into local politics and then, to our horror, get into mainstream politics. And once in a while they get elected to central government. The problem then is they then try to impose their neuroses on the rest of society, which is not the name of the game at all. We then have people who come into this country from overseas who were brought up and educated and moulded in the communist way, and they think that that's the way that they can come to reform our laws and destroy capitalism, as they call it, and to turn us into a federal communist state. Well, an enormous amount of progress has been made in recent years in that direction, because that is what we are now. We are a quasi-communist police state, although we still, fortunately for us, have a constitutional monarchy. Now, the reforms in the House of Lords that they go on and on about are a total nonsense, because if we have an elected second chamber under our constitution, and we do have a constitution, it's both part written and part unwritten, we would then have both houses of our parliament on a collision course, and you would end up with anarchy, because they'd both be elected. If they disagree on policy, chaos. And the Cleggs of this world and the Camerons of this world have not thought this thing through at all in a proper constructive way. They're relying upon people who are ill-equipped to give them proper sound advice, and this chaotic situation is continuing to our detriment.
So what's the alternative to elected House of Lords or a chosen House of Lords?
Well, the concept...
Can you go back to the original hereditary?
Well, the fundamental point is this. Our monarch is based upon the hereditary principle. We have primogeniture in this country. We've had it for centuries, where the oldest son inherits from the father, which of course is something that the Europeans loathe, because the wealth of this nation, and this nation hasn't actually been invaded since the time when the Conqueror. So we have got the most extraordinary quantity of antiques and paintings in the world. And these collections, which get passed down from one generation to the next, they know when they have them, they look after them as custodians to pass on to the next generation. Now, in the same way, in the House of Lords, where we have the hereditary principle, if somebody is born into the peerage, they're educated in a certain way, they're sent off to boarding schools very young, they are totally unjustly treated. So by the time they reach manhood, anything that's thrown at them during their rest of their lifetime, they can cope with, because they've been seriously badly treated as a child. So they're properly equipped to cope with the injustice of life. But the thing is that we also have in the system what are called life peers. So you have people who are put in the Lords who may have come from being a union baron or industry, whatever. And when it comes to debates on legislation being proposed by the government which is in place, an enormous amount of common sense ensues to see what they're proposing, if it's going to be workable in real life. Now, unfortunately, this idea that the hereditary principle is wrong was the formation of the Labour Party to say we had to destroy it. Well, that's all very well and good, but if they had wanted to do it correctly, what they should have done was to have passed independent bills of Parliament to remove each single peer of the realm and cancel the letters patent. But that would have brought the entire machinery of government to a halt. They didn't do it. So we have now a situation of total chaos, where you have life peers who bought their peerages, funding the Labour Party, sitting there, and if they're to be removed to let the true members return to their rightful seats, they will bring the entire machinery of government to a halt. It's a wonderful recipe for chaos.
So that process of the Labour government to try and pull down the hereditary system in our country, including the monarch, was false, and it was all corruption. It was done by false corruption and illegal means by the government at the time, who was Mr. Tony Blair, who's now not as popular as he was then.
If ever he was popular.
But he seemed to have been voted in, whether he was popular or not.
But where do you stop the hereditary principle attack? Because if you say that the heir to the throne in future, if the monarch's eldest child is a daughter, that she should inherit the throne and not the son, and then you say that the hereditary principle when it comes to the peerages, well, what if you happen to be born into a family and your father is a doctor or a lawyer, or he might be a carpenter or a bricklayer, have a trade? Are they going to say, because your parent has chosen that way of life, you're not allowed to follow your parent into that?
Well, normally you find that, quite accurately or often, you find that people go into the family business, in this country anyway, if it's of any stock or wealth or been built up in any form or kind. This isn't necessarily the aristocrats or the absolute millionaires, even small businesses like carpentry or shoemaking or something. They often follow the family business, which has been going on for a while.
But there is another fundamental point here.
But they are changing, I suppose. People are apt to move out now more into different businesses, but on the whole.
So I'm going to have to cut here, but we'll carry on in a moment. Would you like to introduce yourselves to the audience?
Dominic, poet and playwright, or Merryworth, peer of the realm.
I'm sorry we started filming before we had a chance to introduce you to everyone, but the next video will introduce you at the beginning. Well, would you like to introduce yourself and say goodbye?
My name is Thomas Matthew. By trade, I happen to be a master printer. I'm a security printer, and my life has evolved through an interest in politics, although I've never taken up politics as a profession. And as a British subject, which I am, I now know from my European passport that I have no right of abode in this country. As a subject